All right, so the plan is to go for about an hour. If you need a little bit more time than that or a little bit less, that's totally up to you. And then we'll either take a short break and then do Q&A, or we'll go right to Q&A, whatever you would prefer. But usually that starts around 4. I'd like to welcome David Shoemaker to give his talk on a typical psychology and praise and blame and stuff like that. Please welcome our speaker.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks, David, for the invitation. And so the situation here is I was going to give you a different talk entirely. And then last week I was laying in bed, unable to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night at 3 and I couldn't get back to sleep. And so I basically wrote this talk then. So it shares that feeling of a fever dream. There's a lot of weird things that are happening in this talk. But it's really about, so this is the first time I'm presenting it, obviously. And so I'm looking forward to your feedback, but it's about my interest in the nature and the architecture of praise and blame. This is not an interest in the concept so much as it is the human nature of praise and blame and how this works out in our actual practices. And I think we can learn a lot from considering the case of narcissism. So in the literature on moral responsibility, praise and blame are always paired as contraries in the descriptions of what makes for a responsible agent. And so people will say, to be a responsible agent is to be an apt candidate for praise and blame. Blame and praise, praise and blame. But once you start thinking about praise and blame, it starts to become very odd why they've been paired in the way that they have, because there's some striking asymmetries, at least in our ordinary conceptions and the kinds of commitments we have that we call praise and that we call blame. And so here's just a small list. So when it comes to something like apt blame and apt praise, for blame, we tend to think, well, you have to deserve that. And this is what implicates responsibility. And so blame is not appropriate for somebody who doesn't deserve it. Whereas for praise, deserved is unnecessary a lot of the time. We don't think of it as implicating responsibility. We say, something like, hey, that's a beautiful beauty mark. And so this counts as apt praise, but no one deserves it because they're not responsible for that beauty mark. We tend to think of blame as demanding something, and in particular, something fairly robust and tortured. So guilt, remorse, apology, repair, compensation, these sorts of things. Whereas praise is entirely undemanding, and there's not really much of a response that's typically necessary other than thanks. Nothing tortured about that. No need to do something to repair any kind of relationship or bolster some kind of relationship. Nothing like that's involved. There's very often an emotional delivery system that attaches, that we think appropriately attaches to blaming someone. It's typically something like anger. Or maybe, for people who are free will skeptics, something like sadness or disappointment. That's how we were just talking about Dirk Pereboom. That's how he thinks of it. Whereas for praise, there's no particular emotional content that's required. Can very often be entirely dispassionate. For blame, it's fundamentally attitudinal, so it can be private. And there's all sorts of literature on how do we make sense of private blame. Whereas praise does seem fundamentally expressive. You got to express it in order for it to count as praise. Blame is most often moral. So we're blaming people for moral wrongs, for wronging others. Whereas for praise, it's very often non-moral. Nice painting, or I heard you sing that duet. That was great. When it comes to blame, ignorance and excuses are mitigating factors. So, if I blame you for something and you had no idea that you'd done the thing in question or that the thing that you'd done was wrong, then you're off the hook. Whereas blame doesn't seem so, when it comes to praise, it doesn't seem that ignorance or excuses are relevant a lot of times, or they don't mitigate at any rate. This comes out in some really fascinating empirical work. There's some stuff that I've done with David Faraci. I'll just talk about the Dave Pizarro study since we were just talking about him beforehand. He's got paired blame vignettes and paired praise vignettes. And in the blame vignettes, the scenario is this: Someone parks too close to George's car. George gets out and very calmly and deliberately smashes the car's windshield. Versus George gets out and his rage overwhelms him and he smashes the windshield. When people hear that, they mitigate in the second case a bit. They say he's less blameworthy, the person who was overcome by emotion and did the thing. But when it comes to praise, that kind of emotional overwhelmingness doesn't mitigate at all. So the vignette in that case is George walks by a homeless man in the winter and very calmly and deliberately gives him his coat, versus George walks by a homeless man in the winter and his sympathy overwhelms him so that he gives him his coat. And people don't alter their praise judgments in the least. So there's something that's going on in the blame cases of mitigating factors that's not going on in the praise cases. Blame can be painful and unfair. Blame hurts. And so considerations of fairness matter here. And so when you do something that deliberately hurts somebody, you need some kind of moral justification for it. And people will typically appeal to something like desert to give that moral justification. Whereas praise doesn't hurt. Unfairness plays no role, it seems. And so you don't need a moral justification for engaging in the practice of praise. Finally, blame can be dangerous. I mean, you keep blaming someone, you're gonna mess them up. Whereas praise seems utterly innocuous. I mean, all it does is deliver this kind of warm, fuzzy feeling. So on its face, and this hasn't been articulated before, but I mean, on its face, there are just tons of asymmetries between our ordinary conception of blame and praise. This hasn't made its way into the literature yet, except that I think a kind of intuition that some people have. So what do you do with the asymmetries? Well, as I said, these asymmetries haven't been articulated before, but Tim Scanlon has abandoned the use of the phrase blame or praise because he has said, I'm not sure that they're the right contrary pairs. Instead, he thinks that the true contrary of blame is gratitude. So blame typically involves what we call reactive attitudes, reactive emotions, and gratitude is one of those reactive emotions, and it seems to better fit as a contrary of blame. So that's one route. You can just say, well, let's all this other stuff that we've been calling praise, we're not going to deal with that anymore. We're just going to focus on the right contrary, which is this emotional reactive attitude. The other way you can go is to just, so the first way to go is the philosopher's response. The second way to go is the psychologist's response. And so Josh Knobe and George Newman and Paul Bloom and others have reveled in these asymmetries. And so Josh Knobe is making a kind of career out of these asymmetries, saying that, yes, there are ways in which we engage in blame with other people that are just asymmetrical with the ways in which we engage in praising other people. This is in part because of what he calls the good, true self view. Actually, I think I've labeled that with David Faraci, but at any rate, it's a view according to which we think we're essentialists about other people. We think they're truly good deep down inside. And so we only want to attribute desires and beliefs and so forth to them to the extent that we judge those desires and beliefs to be good. And if we judge them to be bad, we don't want to attribute them. And so that's why we get the blame praise asymmetry, is because we think that people are deep down truly good. What I want to do is try to explain and account for all of these as, in fact, symmetrical. And so I think the way to do that is that we have to really take seriously all of the forms of blame and praise that we engage in with one another, especially in their self-directed form. I think we can learn a lot from thinking about cases that haven't been talked about very much. Self-blame and self-praise. And then I think we have to note that there are these pathological manifestations and consequences of both blame and praise practices. And I think by focusing especially on narcissism, that provides us with an aid to discovering what are the non-pathological and apt forms. So this isn't a purely descriptive project here. I have in mind some normativity. And then I'm going to do that by pulling back the curtain on what I think is an enjoyable form of blame that has not gone under that name before, but that has numerous benefits. And then once I explain what's going on, I think you'll see that it is a form of blame, and it really helps dissolve the asymmetries here. Okay, so that's the plan. I want to talk, oddly enough, despite the fact that this is a unifying project, and by the way, I never do unifying projects, so this is my first. Um, but despite the fact that this is in the end a unifying project, I want to start by revealing even more asymmetries. And these are asymmetries within the world of blame. And it's between self-blame and other blame. And this draws a little bit from work that I've done elsewhere. So start with this case. When I suppose that I'm a serial liar, I'm always lying to you and you know it, and I never apologize for it. And then one day I catch you in a lie and I blame you for it. I say, "How dare you lie to me?" And your response is and ought to be, "Who are you to tell me that I'm doing something wrong? You're a serial liar. You do this all the time. You're a hypocrite." Okay. So in blaming other people, we presume a certain kind of moral superiority, at least with respect to that thing. And to the extent that in blaming you, I'm actually guilty of the same thing that I'm blaming you for, I'm actually on your level. I don't have the moral superiority that I'm claiming to have. And you can call me out and rightly call me a hypocrite, therefore. So here's a puzzle. If the only difference between self and other blame is their direction, then every case of self-blame should ground a legitimate charge of hypocrisy. So think about it. If that's the way in which other blame works, that I have a morally superior stance to, I'm presuming to have a morally superior stance to you, then in every case in which I blame myself, I'm here blaming myself here. I'm presuming to have a superiority over myself. And so I say, you shouldn't have done that. That was wrong of you. The blamed self should, in every case, have the standing to say, "Who are you, me, to blame me?" Because you're guilty of exactly the same thing that you're blaming me for. But that's just silly. There's no such thing. We don't have these kinds of cases of hypocritical self-blame, but we obviously do engage in self-blame. So the content of self and other blame have to be different. I've tried to answer how they are different by examining this really fascinating phenomenon that as soon as I describe it, it's going to feel completely resonant, familiar to you. But it's studied apparently a ton in exercise science. And it's this phenomenon known as self-talk. So the idea, and they've studied athletes who engage in this. And the reason it's going to be so familiar is anytime you engage in any exercise, or maybe you were an athlete, you've very likely engaged in something like this. And the operationalization is the self-talk. Verbalizations or statements that are addressed to the self. They're multidimensional in nature. They have interpretive elements associated with content of statements employed, somewhat dynamic, and most importantly, serving at least two functions. It's instructional and motivational. So this is the kind of thing where you're telling yourself, "Oh man, you're doing so great. Keep it up. Just one more rep. Let's do 5 more reps, or you're going to do one more mile." And in study after study, what this shows is that people who engage in this self-talk, it dramatically increases their motivation, has powerhouse physical effects, increases their mental toughness, increases their endurance, it staves off exhaustion. And it has recently moved out of the domain of athletic science to a variety of other psychological areas. And so it's been shown to reduce shyness. So people with social anxiety disorder who engage in self-talk say, "It's all right, you can look at it, you're doing great, just look them in the eye," that kind of thing. It reduces their shyness. It can actually reduce pain. We all know we can talk ourselves out of or into anger or fear. Increases emotional intelligence. Now, here's, I think, the powerhouse finding. Negative self-talk has exactly the same effect. It hasn't been studied quite as much, but the early results show that it has the exact same effect. So when Serena Williams, bashes that tennis racket, "You idiot," or John McEnroe, "What are you thinking?" to himself. This is negative self-talk, and it has the same motivational effects as the positive version. and it has the same endurance effects. So these are the paradigmatic features. It's forward-looking. It's aiming to motivate you. It's aiming to get your head in the game. You have to think of it as a kind of coaching. So it's not accusing you of anything. It's not trying to get you to feel guilty about anything. It's coaching you. It's constructing you. And so as a result, because it's forward-looking and because it's a coaching kind of mechanism, it's not tracking or responding to the why of what you did. So when you say, "You idiot, why'd you do that?" and you respond to yourself, "Well, I've had a really stressful day at work," that means nothing when it comes to these kinds of when it comes to this kind of phenomenon. So it's immune to desert, it's immune to excuses, it's immune to justifications, the ordinary things that we think about when we're thinking about, say, moral responsibility. And it's in complete contrast to paradigmatic cases of other blame, where all of these things are, in fact, implicated. Negative self-talk of this sort, again, "You idiot, what were you thinking?" It's also most often non-moral, almost invariably non-moral, whereas other blame is paradigmatically moral. So in studies, the psychologists have asked subjects, when was the last time you got angry at somebody else? And they describe the scenario, and it's almost always some kind of moral violation. You know, they broke their promise. They didn't pick me up at the airport. They said they would. And then they ask, when was the last time you got angry at yourself? And again, it's almost invariably non-moral. It's things like, "I hit my head on the low ceiling," or "I locked myself out of the house or the car," or in the case of someone like Tom Brady, "I threw an interception." Now, that's where the psychologists stop. I've been interested to try to figure out why this is the case. And here's a proposal. Why is self-blame of this sort non-moral? And it requires a little bit of a background of what I think other blame in its emotional form is. So suppose that you wrong me, you injure me and you wrong me in so doing. And I blame you, I get angry with you. I think anger of this blaming sort is, as I was suggesting earlier, it's demanding something. And what I'm doing is trying to get you to see the reasons that I see for why you should feel guilty, for why you should feel remorseful. And in fact, I'm demanding that you get there via acknowledging what you did to me. So I get angry with you. "Can't you see? You promised, you said you were going to be here, and you left me hanging here, and I had no food," or whatever. What I'm doing is demanding that you acknowledge what it was like to be me when you put me in that horrible position. And so to feel the sort of pain that I felt in having been wronged in that way, and that pain is just remorse and guilt. So I think other blame is just essentially demanding in that way. I'm pointing out reasons to you that once you see will cause you to feel guilt, remorse, fully acknowledge you're wrong, and then begin the repair process. If that's what I'm doing though to myself, then what I'm doing is, if I wrong somebody else and I'm angry at myself, and if we have this model where what I'm doing is demanding this process of me, then the only way I can demand that process is if I already recognize the reasons there were not to do the thing that I did. And so I think that rationally fitting, anyway, moral self-blame is self-effacing. This is just a psychological claim that if I'm angrily demanding that I see the wrong that I did to someone else, that's just an immediate transmogrification into guilt or into remorse, because I already see the reasons that there are. It's not like I have to demand something of myself that I then come to say, "Oh, yes, I see that now," and then I acknowledge it. It's the demanding of myself is the seeing of the relevant reasons to feel remorse. And so in the psychologically healthy, self-blame, this angry self-blame, almost instantly transmogrifies into guilt. By the way, throughout the literature, many people say that guilt is self-blame, and it's just not. It's something different. Self-blame is a kind of anger, moral anger at oneself, but because it instantly transmogrifies into guilt, people have mistaken guilt for self-blame. So that's a story about why I think that rationally fitting moral self-blame is self-effacing. But of course, people still blame themselves angrily in this moral way. So what I'm calling the wrong content. So this unfitting self-directed moral anger happens all the time. Imagine, though, that you've wronged me and I'm angry at you. I'm blaming you. And you recognize you're wrong, and you feel remorse and guilt, and you've compensated me, and you've apologized, and you've repaired the relationship, and nevertheless I continue to be angry at you. Well, at that point, what I'm doing is immoral. It just consists in berating you and whipping you and punishing you unjustly. If you do it to yourself, it's the same thing. That if I've wronged someone and I'm blaming myself with this moral anger that persists despite the fact that I fully acknowledge what I did, I felt guilt, remorse, I've apologized, I've repaired it, then that's just self-beratement, flagellation, and punishment. People do this. But there are three aspects of what is going on. It's highlighting a certain kind of helplessness, because if I can't get my way out of this self-anger by acknowledging, repairing, and so forth, then there's just nothing left for me to do to get rid of this anger at myself. So there's a kind of lack of control that's being highlighted here. It implicates desert. I deserve this. I deserve this punishment, this ongoing punishment. And most importantly, it's directed at your character, my character in that case, and not my behavior. It's characterological. I come to think that not what I did was wrong, but who I am is bad. And that's the source of very familiar pathologies and disorders. So depression, low self-esteem, self-harm, PTSD, maladaptive coping, and suicide. And this is illustrated by the case of Donnie Moore. Some of you who are baseball fans may remember this guy. He was a very good pitcher for the California Angels in 1986. And the Angels were in the American League Championship Series playing the Boston Red Sox, and the Angels were 1 out away from going to the World Series. And they're leading 4-1. And Donnie Moore had been a really good relief pitcher all year long. He gave up a home run to David Henderson, and then the Red Sox rallied, and then they wound up beating. The Angels just collapsed, and the Red Sox went to the World Series instead. Now, after the game, in an interview, he said, "I was horseshit. Somebody's got to take the blame, so I'll take it. I threw that pitch. I lost that game." And of course, that's the last chance you get that season. And it just ate at him and ate at him. And the next year, he was not very good, and he had some injuries. And the year after that, he shot and killed himself. And his agent said of him, I think insanity set in. He just couldn't live with himself after Henderson hit the home run. He kept blaming himself. That home run killed him. And so this is this kind of unfitting, pathological self-blame taken to its worst extreme. Okay, so how do we solve the puzzle of hypocritical self-blame? Why isn't there any? Well, it's because other blame and self-blame consist in their paradigmatic forms in different types of anger. So in other blame, it's what I label slighted anger, and I'd be happy to talk about, philosophy of emotions here. But I think that emotions generally are defined and differentiated in terms of their motivational profiles. And slighted anger is something that we recognize as motivating confrontation, and it's demanding. It demands this remorseful acknowledgement. So it evaluates what you've done as a slight, and it motivates confronting you. There's a different kind of anger, though. And the reason I think there are different kinds of anger is motivated in part by cases of babies. Babies get angry, but they're not angry at slights. And so it's a different kind of anger, and it's paradigmatic form in self-blame. It's just negative self-talk, and it's goal-frustrated anger. So it appraises the situation as frustrating one of your goals, as maddening, and its motivational profile is just to overcome the obstacle in question, and it doesn't demand anything of anybody. Now, very often when people slight us, both of these forms of anger are experienced together. We both want to confront, but also to overcome, but they can be prized apart. So, self-blame in the negative self-talk form just doesn't require any kind of demanding stance. You're not standing in a superior stance demanding that someone, apologize or compensate or anything like that, because it's the second kind of anger. And you can launch that kind of anger. Then that kind of anger can be appropriate from any stance, and so it can't be hypocritical thereby. So the solution to the puzzle here is to point out asymmetries, an additional asymmetry within the world of blame. And so you might say that I'm not doing myself any favors by producing even more asymmetries. You also might ask, well, look, if they are such different kinds of anger and they motivate different kinds of things, and one's backward looking, one's forward looking, why call them both blame? And here the answer is drawn from work I've done with Manuel Vargas. And we think that you cannot unify what falls under the rubric of blame in terms of any particular content. There are counterexamples they're going to attach to any attempt that you make. Instead, what unites them what unites these things as blame is their function. And that involves signaling your commitment to and willingness to police a set of norms. And these have various kinds of prudential benefits for people who are engaged in this kind of policing. Okay, so they're both blame, even though they have different content, because they've got the same this signaling, this important signaling function. Okay, so we've got additional asymmetry within the world of blame. Now let's talk about praise. Here's what I take the ordinary practice to consist in. It just involves giving people compliments and credits. So as I was saying earlier, it has to be expressed in order to count as praise. There's no specific emotional content. Again, it aims at this kind of warm, fuzzy feeling maybe. There aren't any demands that are being made when I praise you. So no authority is needed either. Those two go together. So anyone can do it. Anyone can praise you. A little kid can't blame me in certain respects, but a little kid can praise me. And it tends to be backward looking. It's for things that you've done. You're being complimented for that. So what about self-praise? Well, it turns out that just like in the world of blame, there are asymmetries, there are additional asymmetry between self-praise and other praise. And now we're going to try to start building some symmetries. Self-praise has a lot in common with self-blame. Just like there's no hypocritical self-blame, there's no hypocritical self-praise. Who are you to praise me? Doesn't ever arise. There might be hypocritical other praise. One example might be, and this would be interesting to talk about, but one example might be if I'm, in my local theater group, and Meryl Streep shows up and she says, that was a really special performance, Dave. I've learned a lot from that. I mean, my reaction is, who are you to praise me? You're so much better. You're in a different class altogether. That might be a case, but again, we can talk about this. But there's certainly no hypocritical self-praise. And again, as with self-blame, I think the paradigmatic form of self-praise is this positive self-talk. You're doing such a great job. Keep it up. Keep it up. I know you can do it. I know you've got it within you. You're such a strong person, so forth and so on. That is forward-looking. It's coaching. It's constructive. It's aiming at motivation and improved performance. Runs independently of desert and all these other things. So the why of what you're doing and being praised for is irrelevant. So it's not about merit. And that means it's immune to excuses and justifications. So we've got then I think, a symmetry between self-blame and self-praise in their paradigmatic healthy forms. Self-blame is negative self-talk. Self-praise is positive self-talk. It's a big but here. There's a powerful symmetry between too much blame and praise that we can learn from. Namely, both generate certain psychological disorders when they're internalized, when they're taken to be characterological and not just about behavior. Overblame, we've already talked about this a bit in the Donnie Moore case. Self-blame, but overblame when you overblame others. you just keep hammering at them, that may well deflate their self to the point of depression and self-harm. It's obvious, but there are studies that show this. But here's the interesting one, that overpraise, both of yourself and of other people, can inflate the praised agent self to the point of narcissism. So narcissism, just in general, is a need for admiration, involves dependence on others for self-esteem. There's emotional dysfunction that's involved. And in recent years, psychologists have been happiest, I suppose, with the division between grandiose and vulnerable narcissism. So grandiose narcissism involves this massive sense of entitlement and superiority, involves a disregard and exploitation of others, a desire for dominance, very inflated self-worth, and they're just immune to guilt and shame. Just don't feel it. Don't take responsibility for anything. Vulnerable narcissism involves having a high, but it's still fragile sense of self-worth. It's contingent on environmental feedback, so there's a constant need to get positive feedback from those around them. And so if they don't get it, they're prone to depression, anxiety, and if they get the wrong kind, they're very prone to grievance. They devalue the need to be close to other people. They too are immune to guilt, but there's a strong association between vulnerable narcissists and what's known as withdrawal shame. That is behavior that other people would feel shame about. They don't necessarily feel the shame, but they hide the behavior because they don't like the attribution. They don't like what it reflects about them in other people's eyes. So their behavior changes. Both, it turns out, are a function of improper blaming and praising practices. So it's primarily a matter of certain parenting styles. So grandiose narcissism is one of its primary sources is a certain kind of overpraise and reward, where the child is constantly getting not just positive feedback, but way over the top positive feedback. That is the best drawing you've ever done. And not only is the best drawing, it's the best drawing any child has ever done, this kind of thing. And just again and again, and what happens? It becomes characterological for the growing child to think that not only is she being praised for doing good things, the behavioral aspect, but that she's actually worthy of such praise. And so internalizes it in a way that is characterological. Vulnerable narcissism, the source again, is primarily in a certain parenting style, but this is an inconsistent disciplining. So in cases in which it would be appropriate to praise, they're underpraised, but they're also underblamed, and then they get blamed for things that they shouldn't and praised for things that they shouldn't. But the praise when they get it feels good, and so the child thinks she's worthless when she's failing to be praised. Again, this is a characterological internalization. So one lesson here is that praise, in both its over and its underuse, is very powerful and it's dangerous. And maybe as powerful and dangerous as blame. So in the case of over blame, it tends to lead toward, when it's internalized, it's characterological, can tend to lead towards depression, self-harm, PTSD, and so forth. And when praise is overused, certainly in the grandiose case, it can lead to this kind of disorder. And so this is one way to eliminate. This is an asymmetry that I pointed out at the beginning, that blame is thought to be dangerous, praise is thought to be innocuous. This eliminates that kind of asymmetry. Praise can be perhaps just as dangerous in its manifestations and consequences as blame. Now, how might it be dangerous? I'm going to explain how in a very odd manner by connecting up narcissism and humor. Narcissists have very bad senses of humor. And so to explain what I mean, I have to go through some other psychological work that was done in the early 2000s. And this is on humor styles. This is Martin and colleagues identified 4 different kinds of humor styles and then studied how they affect well-being. So the first 2 are positively correlated with well-being, the second 2 are negatively correlated with well-being. Affiliative humor is the kind of banter and teasing, leg pulling, and so forth that takes place between friends and family members, most often. Self-enhancing humor is the humor that enables people to cope with difficulties of life, and it also includes self-deprecating humor. Self-defeating humor is different. Self-defeating humor is where you allow yourself to be made fun of, you allow yourself to be put upon as the butt of jokes. And aggressive humor involves sarcasm, ridicule, a kind of meanness. And so what the psychologists have studied is the way in which your dominant style affects your well-being. And as I say, the first 2 affect it positively, the second 2 affect it negatively. Now, they've applied this rubric to people with autism, which I could talk about, but I'm just here going to focus on what's known as the dark triad. This consists in Machiavellians, people just like to pull the strings of people around them, get to start conflicts. It's just enjoyable to watch. Psychopaths who do whatever they want independently of other people's interests, don't recognize what those interests are, and narcissists, who we've already talked about. They're studied together because they've got a common core. They are manipulative and quite callous. And their humor style is just going to be, obvious. They tend almost exclusively to aggressive humor. There's some that go for self-defeating humor. Certain vulnerable narcissists sometimes go for self-defeating humor. But it's almost entirely this aggressive humor. So they don't find affiliative humor funny. They don't engage in it. And I'm, of course, talking here in wildly sweeping generalizations. I understand there are spectra here throughout, but just in terms of the paradigm forms, these are the results. I think of the dark triad, members of the dark triad, as what I call humor profligates. And they make 2 kinds of mistakes. One is to think that if you've got comic reasons in place for amusement, then it just completely eliminates any moral reasons there might be for anger. So I'm thinking here of there being multiple value domains that give rise to different kinds of reasons. And so if something has a certain kind of set of properties, incongruity, surprise, cleverness, things like this, they contribute to its comic value. And so that gives you some comic reason to be amused by it. And if it's got certain things like meanness and so forth, then it's got moral reasons to be upset. So suppose, as is the famous example of Trump seeming, if there's some unclarity about this, but seeming to be making fun of or mocking a disabled reporter, Serge Kovaleski. What you hear from humor profligates about these sorts of things is if people get upset, they will say, oh, come on, it's just a joke. And what they intend by that is that you just eliminate whatever moral reason you had to be upset because it's funny. So humor profligates are people who say, well, look, because it's funny, there can be no reason to be morally upset. That's a mistake. Okay. There's some forms of humor that are funny precisely because they're mean. So there's kind of a moral reason to be upset built into the funniness. And so the fact that it's funny can't eliminate the moral reason to be upset because that's just what makes it funny. So that's a mistake that humor profligates make. That's one. Another is that they see reasons for amusement that just don't exist. So here, the pranks are sometimes funny. I think it's the lowest form of humor, but they can maybe be funny. And the most famous literary prank in literary history was Stephen King's Carrie, filmed by Brian De Palma, starring Sissy Spacek. And I can tell you what other facts about the movie. And so the story is that Carrie is put upon a naive schoolgirl in high school, and the other students make fun of her all the time. And some of the meaner students decide to put together a really elaborate, horrible prank that at the prom, they're going to make her think that she's the prom queen, and they're going to dump a bucket of actual pig's blood on her, which they do in this scene. And then you see the mean girl starts a laughing cascade that gets the entire group of students laughing at Carrie, and it's all hilarious until Carrie destroys the town with her telekinetic powers. Now, profligates are those who see something like this and they say, well, pranks have funny making features. This is a prank, has a joke-like feature. And so, hey, yeah, it's funny. And what they don't recognize is that some cases that have these kind of prank-like features have such cruelty that are embedded in them that they're just not funny. Now, you may resist that. I have another example I'll give in a little while that I think makes the case more forcefully. But the idea would be that profligates are those who see what they think are comic reasons and they actually aren't. And so they're amused by things they shouldn't be because there's just no funny there. Members of the dark triad make both of those mistakes, right? They think if something's funny, then you should not be upset by it. And they see reasons to be amused that just don't exist. Why? It's the core. It's the common shared core of members of the dark triad. They have serious empathic impairments. So that means they can't see when cruelty, as in the Carrie case, vastly increases the strength of the moral reasons relative to the comic reasons, or just undermines whatever comic reasons there might have been altogether. So one example I gave was Carrie case. Here's another example that might make the case more powerful. Suppose that I've come to visit you in a new town, Buffalo, say, and you are going to take me to a museum this morning, and you don't tell me what museum it is or anything. And so I'm on my phone the whole time. I don't see us getting there. I don't even notice when we arrive, and we get out and I'm still on my phone, and you go in and you pay for the ticket. And I walk in, and I don't know what kind of museum I'm in or anything. At the first exhibit, I see this, a skeleton in this kind of, well, it's kind of a humorous pose. And so I chuckle a little bit. That's kind of funny. And I look around and I realize I'm in a Holocaust museum. And the placard said, this is what it looked like when a Nazi broke a Jew's neck. I think that just eliminates any comic reasons altogether. Profligates are those who are still going to be amused by this kind of thing. They think, this is that second mistake, they think they're comic reasons when they aren't. Empathic impairments make it difficult to see these things. They also make it so that they can't see any reason to be upset by someone's psychological pain when there's comedy afoot. And so there are some absolutely devastating and brutal insults that have some funny to them, but they don't recognize there any reason for that person to be upset. There are reasons for that person to be upset, even if there are comic reasons. So that means that easily translates to their not being able to see reasons most generally against causing pain, engaging in kind of mean pranks or brutal insults themselves. But what are these? What are these empathic impairments? They all contribute to moral failings. These are all moral failings. So those of the dark triad are humor impaired because they're morality impaired. But I think it's also true, vice versa, that they are morality impaired because they're humor impaired. That's the way I set up the story. And that's because there's a common cause. They're empathically impaired. So I think that's a really interesting result, that competence for the comic domain, having a good sense of humor requires a good sense of morality, and vice versa. So empathy impairments predict both these. They predict a poor sense of humor and poor sense of morality. But now, to return to the central topic, they also predict a poor sense of blame. So take the ordinary case of blame. When I blame you, what I'm doing is I'm demanding something of you, namely guilt or remorseful acknowledgement, that you appreciate and understand what it was that you put me through. What is that? I'm demanding empathy. That's what ordinary blame demands. It's empathy. And if you've got an empathic impairment, then that demand is just senseless to you as a demand. And you're going to reject it. So if you've got an empathic impairment and I'm blaming you in this demanding way, you're going to reject it because it's just inapplicable to you. It either makes no sense as a demand, or it's something that you're just simply incapable of understanding as what it is. And of course, that's just what narcissists and the other members of the dark triad do. They reject blame. This is one of the symptoms of membership in the dark triad is failure to take responsibility, rejecting blame. This looks like I've just dug myself into a deeper hole. That it looks like what narcissists are asymmetrical people. They absolutely accept praise. They have no problem accepting praise. They're hungry for it. They reject blame in a way that they're incapable of understanding what the blame demand consists in. And so they just don't get it as a form of communication. That looks like there is a deep asymmetry between praise and blame because praise requires a certain capacity that narcissists have, whereas blame requires a certain capacity that they don't. And that suggests that there's a deep asymmetry between the two because they're just implicating different kinds of capacities. So as I said, it looks like this may be digging the hole even deeper. The way to get out of it is to recognize that when psychologists say narcissists don't accept blame, they reject blame, that's ambiguous. And it's ambiguous between their being unable to see its force or understand it as a demand, these kinds of things, and they're simply wanting to avoid it. And to the extent that they're impaired for empathy, they just can't see or feel the force of blaming demands for empathy. So to the extent that my blame of a narcissist is kind of second personal demand, that they recognize what they've done, that what they did to me, and remorsefully acknowledge it, they can't see or feel the force of that because they're incapable of taking up my perspective and feeling the thing that I feel in the way that I felt it. So they're incapable of remorseful acknowledgement. That makes that kind of blaming demand inapt for them. But they can see and feel the force of another type of blame. And it's a blame that they dish out to others. But they can't take it. And by take it, I mean they hate it. But they understand it. So go back to affiliative humor. A crucial form of affiliative humor between friends and family is mockery, making fun of someone for their failure to live up to a normative standard. So this happens in my family all the time. I'm sure it happens in yours. There's long lost things that you've done that are still raised at Thanksgiving. I can't believe you did that, they say, pointing at you and making fun of you for it. So it's there has been some kind of failure to live up to a normative standard, but also there's mockery that returns people to an equal normative status. So the people who are getting the big head in the family, who have made a name for themselves outside of the family very often will keep them grounded through mockery, bring them back down to size. One example of mockery is self-mockery, and this is a form of self-deprecating humor. It's just full of self-mockery. Here's a good example from Jon Stewart. I'm 145 pounds of asthma. There are tons of values here in mockery amongst friends and family. And this has been the subject of some study in recent years. It is a powerful bonding mechanism, creates and maintains very special relationships between friends and family. If we're all members of the in-group and we mock someone from the out-group, it serves to bond those members and rally the troops against those out-groups. And this is particularly valuable for certain underprivileged groups who, so for example, in the deaf community, there are a whole range of jokes about hearing people, and makes fun of how they talk to deaf people. And this serves as a powerful bonding technique for people in that community. Self-mockery people find attractive, but it's also a really great defense against attack. You undercut the attack of your enemy or your nemesis by making fun of yourself before they can. Renders them toothless in a powerful way. But most importantly, it's a valuable corrective. So Francis Hutcheson said, when you mock people for their faults, they're apt to be made sensible of their folly more than by a bare grave admonition. Men have been laughed out of faults that a sermon could not reform. So these are all values of mockery. What are they also? They're valuable signals. They're clearly signals when you're mocking people. You're signaling your commitment to a set of normative standards and your willingness to enforce those normative standards. That's just the signaling theory that Manuel and I have talked about. And this generates lots of long-term prudential benefits. People want to associate with you. They want to be friends with you. They want to hang around with you. They want to do business with you. They want to be mates with you and so forth. So lots of values here. Now, as I was saying earlier, although narcissists do mock other people, they hate, absolutely detest being mocked. And they don't tend to engage in self-mockery, the self-deprecating humor. That's, again, one of those self-enhancing humor styles that correlates positively with well-being. Many people think that this photo captures the moment that Trump decided to run for president, when Obama was just raking him over the coals at the correspondents' dinner, I think in 2015 or 2014. And he's got a smile on his face, but it's not a happy smile. And so here's my proposal. The mockery is actually a kind of blame. It's an unrecognized kind of blame. It's not called that. But what does it do? It polices and enforces a group's normative standards, but it does so in a more pleasant way through amusement that even the mocked person can, of course, get behind. Narcissists reject this, but it's not the kind of rejection where they just don't understand it. It's not a demanding form of blame. It's not they don't understand it. They just hate it. It's something that they fully appreciate when they do it to others, but they hate it when it's done to them. So they see and feel the force. If we incorporate mockery blame into the general architecture of blame, then we get the symmetry that we've been missing with ordinary praise. Mockery blame, it cuts across all normative domains. It includes morality, but it's mostly non-moral. We mock people for their aesthetic failures, athletic, prudential, etiquettal, epistemic failures. It has the signaling function that makes a thing praise or blame. So it's unified in that respect. Narcissists do have the capacity to be pricked by it, to be ruffled by it, to be deflated by it, just as they have the capacity to be inflated by praise. So where we were worried earlier that praise implicates capacity that blame doesn't, now we've got a kind of blame that looks like it implicates exactly the same kind of capacity, having to do with inflation and deflation of the self. And so just to finish up here, go back to the initial chart, and here focus on the apt mocking blame versus apt ordinary conception of praise, and just go through them. Desert is unnecessary for both. I mean, you say in the case of praise, beautiful beauty mark, you say sincerely, whereas you can say, beautiful beauty mark, sarcastically, then that counts as the kind of negative form, but desert is unnecessary for both, for the aptness of both. Neither one is demanding, so there's not much response necessary. In the praise case, all you need to say is thanks, typically. Whereas in the mocking blame case, there's no guilt, remorse, apology. None of that tortured stuff is associated with it. Maybe just some sheepish amusement. Yeah, all right, you got me. There's no particular emotional content required in either case. You can mock someone acidly, or you can mock someone dispassionately. They're both fundamentally expressive. You may want to push back on this, but it seems to me that mockery is, there's not private mockery. There's mockery maybe that I whisper to you, but I think it's fundamentally a kind of expressive, but maybe not a lot hangs on that. It's most often non-moral. I suggested earlier, you can mock someone for their moral failings, but most of the time we're mocking people for their non-moral failings, perhaps because moral failings typically are much more serious. Ignorance and excuses now mitigate neither. So, I mock you for some aesthetic failure, or for some, I mocked you for some sporting failure. You got caught between first and second base. You know, you weren't paying attention or something. I'm making fun of you for that. And you say, yeah, well, I'd had a hard day at work earlier. It doesn't matter to the aptness of the mockery. So that doesn't get you off the mockery hook. Now look at the praise side. As I said at the beginning, there's no moral justification needed for praise. Pain plays no role. It doesn't hurt to be praised. So there's no worries really about unfairness that we have to justify morally. There is a sting, and it's necessary for the thing to count as mockery. Again, this is something else you might want to push back on, but I've thought about this a lot, and I can't think of any case of positive mockery where you're mocking someone in a positive way that doesn't either count as it's just faux mockery, it's mock mockery, or it's you're actually mocking them for something else that you really do view as in a negative way, as a kind of normative failure. So anyway, there's a sting that's necessarily attached to successful mockery, but you don't need a moral justification for it necessarily, because now you've got a separate source of reasons, comic reasons. And so to the extent that it's funny, any reason there might be to be upset by it might well be outweighed by the comic reasons. And then finally, I'd said earlier, yes, blame is dangerous. Mocking blame is dangerous too, of course. I mean, it's the preferred form of communication from the schoolyard bully, after all, and can lead to all sorts of pathologies, sure. But remember, so is praise. Praise can be quite dangerous too, can be the source of narcissism, which has all sorts of, well, comic and moral problems. So just to conclude, sorry, I've gone a little over here, but this is the overall architecture that I've tried to build. You've got blame and praise, and then you've got demanding and non-demanding forms of both other praise and self-praise and blame. And so the demanding form of other blame is the slighting anger, which demands remorseful acknowledgement that attaches mostly to moral wrongs, whereas gratitude is its contrary pair. And I haven't said much about gratitude, but I'd be happy to talk about that. Where I think that when you're expressing your gratitude to someone, there's a demanding aspect of that as well. You're demanding that they recognize how they made you feel. That is to say, good, they benefited you. And a sense of gratification is what's being demanded. But then the non-demanding form of other blame and praise, other blame is the mocking form. And this is the category I've introduced here. This is what is the right contrary pair to compliments and credits. So praise seeks to soothe, but there are extreme versions in various directions that predict narcissism, and mocking aims to sting, has to, but that can, in its extreme forms, lead to vulnerable narcissism as well, but also kind of deflation. And then in the self versions that's demanding, you can have self-directed slighting anger. But I argued that in the psychologically healthy, that's typically self-effacing, immediately transmogrifies into guilt or remorse. Or if it does persist unfittingly, then that's what typically generates depression or shame. So in general, this kind of self-directed slighting anger is inapt. It's also inapt, I think, in the positive case, where what you're doing is heaping this kind of adoring gratitude on yourself. Again, in the psychologically healthy, that's going to be self-effacing, transmogrifies into gratification. Or if it persists and you internalize it as characterological, it's going to increase your sense of entitlement and inflate your self-worth beyond recognition, maybe. And then finally, in the non-demanding forms of self, blame and praise, it's just negative and positive self-talk. But also there are forms of humor that I think apply here as well. The non-demanding form of self-blame is kind of self-deprecating humor, and in the positive form, it's kind of self-enhancing humor. And so this is a category as well that I think I've added to the architecture, and that enables us to see the overall symmetries. And so I think that addresses all the issues. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your talk. Did you want to take like 5-10 minutes for a break, or did you want to go straight to Q&A?
I can go straight in, but if you want a 2-minute break, I would not object.
I'm hearing no nods or any like forceful things. We can just go right into Q&A then.
All right.
So for Q&A, would you like me to keep track of the order in which they come in, or did you want to do that yourself?
Why don't you do it? I don't know if there's any kind of protocol here, or you have to watch out for raging egos or anything. So.
Yeah. So if you have a question, either use the raise hand function or literally raise your hand. We'll start with Bob Kelly. Then did I see Pat Daly? Did you have your hand up after Bob? No? Okay, we'll do Phil is second. And so start with Bob.
All right. Super interesting. I liked a lot of that talk. Some I disagree with. So I will start with kind of a big picture question, I guess. And by start, I don't mean I'm going to ask a bunch of questions, but for now, I'll ask the kind of a big picture question, which was, I guess in short, here's the short question, or wondering I have. I wonder if you're changing the subject in kind of an important way. And by that, I mean, when you put up these contrasts between blame and praise, first, I'm not sure I buy all the asymmetries. It just seems, and part of the reason it leads me to this question, part of the reason is that it just doesn't seem like praise to me, all this like right-hand stuff. And so I'm very sympathetic to the Scanlon kind of response, which is just that this is just not the contrary to blame. And I know you sort of acknowledge that later. So trying to figure out how to ask this question most simply, but I guess I'll just say, it seems like the Scanlon style response, or the sort of intuitions I have about this, is just to understand blame and praise in terms of what are the appropriate responses to this thing that we really care about, which is blameworthiness and praiseworthiness. And it seems like that's what Strawson's talking about with the reactive attitudes. Like, what are the appropriate sorts of attitudes when someone is blameworthy, when someone is praiseworthy? And it seems like you've changed from reactive attitudes to rehabilitative attitudes or something like that. Like, let's look at certain psychological reactions that we have and see if there's symmetries between those and what the functions of those psychological states are. And we just lost actual blameworthiness and praiseworthiness. And so on the right side, I would say, if we're talking about praiseworthiness and the way that we talk about blameworthiness, none of those are appropriate. No, you should not praise the person for their beauty mark, right? Like, I don't even know what that would mean. But I'm thinking about being praiseworthy, right? And if that kind of attitude was apt, and I would think that it wasn't. So I'm wondering if there's transgression is doing a lot of the difference here between those things on either side. For there's a transgression that blame is getting at. That's why some of these other things don't map on the praise side, because there's no transgression. So I wonder if I guess I just am wondering what your response would be to that. It seems like we're just talking about something else now. We're not really talking about blameworthiness and praiseworthiness in the sense that it's getting at something we care about. Blameworthiness, praiseworthiness, and I may be sneaking in a parabim kind of understanding of that stuff where you deserve in virtue of doing something right or wrong that you knew, right. But that's important. That's what a lot of people are talking about. So it's not that it's illicit to do that. I'm just wondering if that is kind of a hidden fact about this project.
Yeah, that's a really terrific question. I really appreciate it. And I have a lot to say about it, because it touches on several bugbears. Let's see, let me think how to start this. So you're absolutely right that a lot of the interest in blame and praise, well, maybe 99% of the interest in blame and praise has been driven by people's interest in responsibility. And when you're interested in responsibility, you're interested in articulating blameworthiness and praiseworthiness. And so it makes perfect sense for people who are driven by that kind of theoretical motivation to want to regiment what counts as falling under the various rubrics, depending on the ways in which they fit into their overall schema of responsibility generally. And so you get Scanlon, who's got a relationship-based theory of responsibility, saying that blame is a matter of altering your relations with someone in a way that what they did wrong makes appropriate. And so it makes perfect sense, if you want to have a contrary, to say, what's the pair there that involves a change in relationship based on something good that someone has done? Gratitude fits that bill absolutely perfectly. But this is what I call a kind of theory-drenched view of responsibility. I don't think Strawson has this kind of view at all. I think when Strawson never mentions worthiness, blame or praise, worthiness. I think Strawson is trying to put together a very naturalistic view of understanding our practices and the way that we relate to one another. And what that does is press us to think more carefully about the variety of responses that are involved in our actual practices. So I don't want to beg the question in favor of a certain kind of theory-drenched regimentation of what responses count and what don't. I think actually this is a big tent kind of paper where I say there's room there to include both the pairing of angry blame or resentment and gratitude, but there's also room to include all of these other features that we consider to be praise. And here's a theory-based reason to do that, that back in the good old days of the 80s, I guess, some of the first across-the-board theorists of moral responsibility, I'm thinking in particular of Michael Zimmerman, were ledger theorists of responsibility. And according to the ledger theorists, what responsibility is just being an apt candidate to having your name written down on a certain, the good things that you've done written down in the ledger of your life, and the bad things written down in the ledger of your life. And that's an account of praise. That's exactly what I'm talking about, is the ordinary conception. It's credits that go into your bank account of life, basically. Now, Zimmerman does want to talk about desert, for sure. And he thinks that that's going to get rid of some kinds of praise. But once we go down the path of trying to take seriously the actual practices that we've got and the responses that we've got, and the fact that there is in the literature this kind of lurking worry, it's never explicitly made, that when we pair blame and praise, I don't know, we're doing something odd because there is something off a bit about praise. Then I see a motivation of let's just bring it all in. Let's just bring it all in and let's see if we can sort it out and see if we can make sense of why we've thought of blame and praise as contraries, despite the fact that they have these seeming asymmetries, and how we can make sense of there actually being symmetries in our ordinary practice by appealing to things that nobody has talked about, mockery, as falling under the rubric of responsibility. Now, just to conclude, I know it's a long answer, but again, I said I have a lot to say about it. So I've thought a lot about it. But it may at the end not be the case that blame and praise are fundamentally responsibility responses. So I want to allow for that possibility, that we may just have to divorce responsibility from our ordinary practices of praise and blame, because to the extent responsibility commits us to things being up to us, and there are certain features of praising and blaming, mocking practices that don't attach to things being up to you, like the beauty mark and these other things that are just happen. Your parents, I can mock you for your parents. That at some point we can make a choice. We can either stick to the theoretical approach that you've articulated, which is to say, no, look, there are certain theoretical commitments I've got. I'm interested in this, and this implies only, say, gratitude as the relevant contrary pair, and there's no reason to go any further than that. Let's just focus on this and see what the metaphysical conditions of this are. That's what Dirk does, but Dirk also says, I recognize that there are these other kinds of responsibility. Those just aren't the ones that I'm interested in. But in order to be able to make that move, you have to be able to have a full picture of what the entire architecture is, and some of them may not implicate responsibility. And you may say at the end of the day, that's not so interesting to me then. But you may be like me, really fascinated by the way in which mockery serves to enforce normative boundaries. I find that really fascinating. And so I'm sort of made the last decade of my career, I've made my study of responsibility move me away from talk of responsibility, ironically enough. I'm really interested in the responses that we have. So again, long-winded answer, but I hope that addresses the issue.
Thanks, David, for the talk. I thought it was really interesting. And if Hirschnoff gives you a hard time or makes you feel guilty about giving a talk that's not in philosophy of medicine for this group, you should mock him. But I had a few questions, but let me just ask one kind of general one, since you're also working on humor, I think. So if we like explain a joke, it kind of undermines the joke, right? So it's not funny. Is there a sense in which that could happen with the subject of your talk today too? Like the more we analyze these kinds of reactions, they wouldn't be as effective in sort of getting us what they're supposed to do?
That's really interesting. Sorry, hold on. I thought this might be the case. I'm writing a book on humor, and on in particular called Wisecracks. And so it's the kind of informal banter that takes place between friends. So it's not about jokes, it's really about interpersonal relationships. And so I started paying attention to them more and trying to piece together what makes them funny. And I found this is just total, autobiography, but I found that no, they're just as funny. It's just kind of fascinating to figure out what makes them tick as well. Same thing goes for the description that novelists give when they reread a great novel and they figure out how it works. It doesn't move them any less. So I guess the first pass at an answer is no. I mean, it could well be that as I'm mocking you, that you say, well, I see what you're doing. You're regimenting the boundaries of our normative landscape. And that may or may not be the case. I may be mocking you with that aim, or I may not. I mean, I think the beauty of the signaling theory is it doesn't require any conscious understanding of what it is that you're signaling when you're actually signaling. So I think these things can work. The only scary bit, possibly, is people who are aware of it, maybe members of the dark triad, are capable of exploiting these kinds of things and manipulating people in ways that we might find objectionable. It might well be that, to the extent, now I have to think about this. I was going to say that to the extent people are deliberately policing the boundaries with mockery, say, that we might find that less funny or somehow objectionable, but I'm just not sure that that's the case. I don't know if that's true. So I guess, my answer is no, I'm not too worried. But do you have reason to be?
I'm not sure. And I don't think I have a very developed thought on it, but if I thought that my attitude of self-blame wasn't authoritative, then I don't know if I would take it as seriously. I'm not sure. But I thought maybe you had thought about that, or sort of what's the what's the consequence that, or what's the reason, like, we haven't looked at these and the sort of philosophers haven't gone into some of this architecture in very detail. Does it have to do with, like, we're afraid of what we might find, or worried about the effects?
I don't know. I mean, there's a couple famous studies in the literature that suggest when people truly start to believe that determinism is true, that they tend to do immoral things. So they're more likely to, cheat on the exam. That's the way it's put. But this is one of those studies that was a prime target of replication problems. So it really is unclear what the evidence is. And I think that, and I'm a thoroughgoing Straussonian on this point, that even once we've thoroughly described the nature of the practices, no theoretical conclusion is going to change the fact that when you step on my foot for no good reason, I'm going to be angry at you, I'm going to resent you. And it takes an almost yogic capacity for many people to eliminate those kinds of genuine, eruptive, urgent kinds of emotional responses, which is what's going on, I think, in all of the emotionally tinged versions of blame and praise.
All right, should we go then to Harvey Berman and then Steve Kirshner after him?
David, thank you. There's a group, I don't know if you can hear me because I don't see
Yes.
myself. Okay. There's a group think in humor, and the photo you showed of Obama and Trump, I remember very well the group think. The audience loved what Obama was saying about Trump. I didn't think it was humor. I thought it was just blatant insult. Do you consider insult the same as mockery? And the audience, the correspondents were laughing. So it's this group think that, if you have a bunch of people approving of what you're saying, they start laughing regardless whether they get it or not. So I'd like to ask you two things about insult humor and what you think the meaning of a good sense of humor is versus a bad sense of humor versus someone with no sense of humor. Is there a distinction there?
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, I'm glossing mockery as making fun of. And that definition doesn't necessarily mean that it's funny. What it requires is not necessarily funny, but what it requires is a sting. You're aiming to sting someone for some kind of normative failure. Whether or not it's funny depends on whether or not it has certain other properties, a certain kind of incongruity, a certain kind of superiority, which maybe some people object to that, but it's an account of what people find funny, whether or not it has a certain kind of cleverness, certain kind of authorial intent. There's just a whole bunch of properties, I think, that together we ultimately have to make reference to our humor responses. So I have a response dependent understanding of the nature of the funny. So I didn't make that distinction in the talk between mockery and funniness. And so to the extent that I haven't, it might well be that mockery overlaps quite heavily with insult. And I don't have a huge problem with that. And so it might well be that you consider this just to be a string of mocking insults that weren't funny. For me, that's fine. It's going to fall under the rubric of what I'm calling mockery blame. It's serving to police certain kinds of normative boundaries. But I think when it's effective, it's funny. Now, whether or not that translates into people laughing at it, or whether or not that people's laughter translates into it's being funny, I think those are two wholly separate things. So we laugh at things that are not funny. In fact, I think the studies on this are something like 80 to 90% of the laughter that occurs in our day-to-day lives is not anything that we would call funny. It's just social grease, a lot of it. And so that goes to your point, that once you're in an audience like this, it's contagious in a way that people aren't evaluating the properties of the funny. Instead, they're just caught up in this kind of party atmosphere. And so, but that doesn't tell us anything about the funny. And so I totally take your point and agree with it, that this could just be a case of pure insult, where that falls under my rubric of mockery, and that it wasn't funny. But nevertheless, it could serve that blaming function that I'm talking about. I think it's more effective when it's funny. because it softens the sting. Because the mocked person can at least say, okay, yeah, all right, that was funny, I have to admit it. I'll just tell you a very quick story. My neighbors and I were in a horrible battle. We were hating each other for a long time. He had an illegal business on his driveway, so he was running his table saw 6-7 days a week, all day long. It was driving me crazy. Police were involved. Anyway, no violence. But during the period in which we were having this dispute, I started receiving all of these emails and letters coming in the mail, advertising for retirement homes out in the country. And I couldn't put the two together for a while until one day I realized, I see what's happening. You're recommending that I go live out in the country because I can't stand noise. And at that point I thought, all right, that was pretty good. I got to give you that. And so it softens, the blaming that was happening there. So I think that's the more valuable form, especially if mockery blame of this sort is supposed to be forward-looking, and it's supposed to achieve the results, and if it's supposed to affect vulnerable narcissists. Vulnerable narcissists aren't affected as much by straightforward insults as they are by people being amused at them. And so for that to have that effect, for them to engage in that withdrawal shame behavior, for them to change their ways, I think the funny has to be attached to it, has to be a witty zinger. Regarding good, bad, and no sense of humor, yeah, I'm working on this, and I'm drawing both from the dark triad, but also from autism, also from mania, and also from depression as the kinds of examples in which there are extremes that make such people's senses of humor flawed in some way. Not necessarily criticizable, because these are faults that are beyond their control, but they're flawed. And so from there, trying to draw a picture of what a good sense of humor looks like. But it's taking some time. I think it requires, as came out today, absolutely requires empathy. Again, I'm not talking about jokes, I'm talking about wisecracks. And so when you're engaged in wisecracks with one another, in order for you to have a good sense of humor, you have to have a good sense of empathy. You have to know where to draw the line, as it were. You have to know that this person can take this much, this person can only take this much. Now, the fact that people find or don't find things amusing doesn't necessarily implicate whether what you've said is funny. But there's a kind of sensibility there that's an interpersonal sensibility that if you're going around making hilarious jokes that make people feel miserable, that doesn't strike me as you're having a great sense of humor. But tons more has to be said about this. So I think on the one hand, you've got what today I call the profligates. You've got the people who say, "Oh, come on, that was funny," and that just serves to, eliminate all reasons for upset. On the other hand, you've got prigs, and the prigs say, as long as there's any immorality or any reason to be morally upset involved, then it can't be funny. And they don't necessarily approximate the no sense of humor, but it's a poor sense of humor at the other extreme. It's hard to think of human beings who aren't profoundly intellectually disabled who have no sense of humor. I think it'd be like finding someone who has no sense of anger or no sense of fear. They might, but this is such a fundamental human capacity, or sensibility, I should say, that I think it's universal, as universal as those things are.
Steve?
Thank you. I hope to speak with you afterwards.
Sure.
Okay, David, I really enjoyed the talk. I had the same thought. I had the same thoughts that Bob Kelly. And here was, I thought, one way of looking at it. Imagine we're deciding, is praise and blame a function of accountability, which is going to presuppose moral responsibility, or attributability, which will not. And it seems to have a lot of features that kick into accountability. That is, it seems that excuse and justification do affect whether or not we think that praise and blame is appropriate. Well, that's a signal that's accountability. We think that attributability mere attributability can be undercut. And I'll just give you a couple examples. If Patty Hearst is brainwashed, and we say, well, look, we blame you in some sense for robbing the bank. The answer is no, you just don't understand blame properly. I mean, you've been brainwashed. Take an excuse if we say, well, you know, we blame Donald Trump for making fun of a disabled person, and then we discover, which looks to be the case, that this is just a standard way of sort of making fun of waffling individuals. Then we think, okay, well, look, blame becomes inappropriate. So I guess the way that we standardly apply excuse and justification to praise and blame is a pretty good indication that what we're looking at is accountability and not attributability. One other way to do it is we use metaphorical praise and blame. You know, we praise the Wolverine for its ferocity, or we praise the giant centipede for its relentlessness, but we're not really praising in any sense, right? Although we are doing excellent attribution there. I mean, the Wolverine is in fact ferocious, and the giant centipede is in fact relentless. So I think there's at least some indications, and I think they're actually sufficient to suggest that praise and blame are tracking accountability by itself and not attributability.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you. So several things here. So I take accountability to be, and I think you do as well, accountability to be vulnerability or susceptibility to being held to account for some kind of, I don't want to beg any questions. I'll just say slight, whether or not that's moral or not, I don't know. And being held to account in a particular sort of way. And I take that way, and maybe here's where you disagree. I take the way that we're talking about when we're talking about holding to account is this demanding form of holding to account. It's kind of this second personal demand, that I have a distinctive kind of reason, that's a reason that is a kind of demanding reason that I can appeal to and give to you that you'll accept, given that you're a certain kind of creature. That we stand in a certain kind of accountability relation to one another, and there are certain kind of reasons that apply just to us in virtue of that. And so to the extent that accountability of the negative form is of that ilk, it's of a demanding ilk, it requires a certain kind of authoritative stance. I have the authority to hold you to account for a failure with respect to this set of reasons. That's the aspect I take to be fundamental to accountability, and that's the aspect I take to be missing from the ordinary understanding of praise, from the ordinary conception of praise. I think that that is present in gratitude, and I think you can give a kind of demand and authority-based understanding of gratitude accountability, but I don't think you can in ordinary cases of praise if what we're talking about are compliments and credits. Because I don't have to have any kind of authority and to give you those credits. And when I do, I'm not making any demands of you at all. So again, this goes back to the question, are we going to be theory drenched here and say, look, I've got this, you know, worked out machinery of the way in which accountability has to work, and that just means we have to be revisionary about what we're going to count as praise? Or do you say, as I want to say, on a kind of response drenched account, that no, we've got a whole range of practices and responses here that we very often refer to as praise and blame, and I don't want to dismiss this whole cloth. Now, I also have I do have a different understanding of attributability here. So just to mark the difference between what I take to be attributability and your Wolverine and Caterpillar cases. I take attributability to be to require the capacity for cares and commitments, because what we attribute to people are attitudes, and we attribute them to their character, and we do so via things like admiration, disdain, contempt. And what we're doing are evaluating certain kind of aspects of their practical agency. Now, these may be aspects over which they have no control, but nevertheless, they're aspects of a certain kind of robust, sophisticated practical agency that doesn't apply to Wolverines or Caterpillars. So I'd want to resist that, but that's a theory drenched, that's a theory drenched kind of response. I fully appreciate that, but I've worked out this machinery elsewhere. So if I'm inconsistent, I'll own up to that. But you have a response.
Yeah, I mean, my concern is that, so when you move to attributability, even in your sense, rather than accountability, it seems that the signaling function, the unifying function, is something like normative regulation. Problem is that there's lots of normative regulation that's independent of praise and blame. I mean, we have, violence and threats, that's normative regulation. We sort of economically deal with people and don't deal with others. That's independent of praise and blame. On some theories of punishment, the classic retributivists, that's independent of praise and blame. So if we think, look, what we're looking for is attributability unified by normative regulation, that's going to be too broad. But accountability is going to get the success conditions. That is, when have you successfully, because in the sort of conversational account you have, here's an excellent defense against praise and blame. Look, I was brainwashed, or I didn't do it, or I had a gun to my head. Those all seem to defeat praise and blame. It's not clear why they would do so in the attributability case. I mean, if I'm brainwashed and that's the sort of person that I've been turned into, it is a correct criticism of me that I'm a bank robber like Patty Hearst. But I have an excuse. So yeah, so two arguments. One, if it's normative regulation as your signaling function, that's too broad. And second, the success conditions seem to indicate that we're talking, we're interested in accountability and not attributability. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, that's great. So one of the things that I want to capture that is not captured by contemporary accounts of accountability is what I think, and I've resisted this for years, are the forward-looking elements that are involved in blame and praising practices. So accountability, as so described, is entirely backward-looking. It's to say you did this thing, and it is, in a sense, on a model, on an analogy with, I'm not entirely comfortable with, but it's on an analogy with criminal responsibility, as you were saying. And so that's why people will associate there being excuses and justifications that are analogous in both the criminal and the interpersonal moral accountability domain. But we don't allow in the criminal responsibility arena these kinds of forward-looking considerations that have become part of the conversation in recent years amongst certain theorists of responsibility. Victoria McGeer, Manuel Vargas, but it goes back to Bernard Williams and Miranda Fricker, and they're talking about this notion of proleptic blame, which is to blame someone in an entirely forward-looking way. That's an attempt to introduce to them reasons that they didn't have access to at the time of the action. But nevertheless, they want to call it blame. Well, you can only do that if you incorporate all of these forward-looking elements, which some parts of our ordinary conception of praise do. And so accountability is too narrow to account for that aspect, the forward-looking aspect, and what I was suggesting were the non-demanding features of praise and blame. It may well be that if you're just talking about normative regimentation or normative policing of boundaries, that there are a variety of ways in which you can do that we're not going to say fall under the rubric of blaming or praising. You're exactly right about that. So the way that part of the argument works is simply that this at least fits that signaling account that we fill in much more detail elsewhere. And so it doesn't violate that understanding of the function of, or a function of blame and praise. And so it's compatible. That's the only part that part of the argument is doing. So accountability is too narrow. Attributability in that ultra wide sense is going to be probably too wide, but I want to restrict that in terms of practical agency. So I think at the end of the day, the theoretical virtues that it incorporates the forward-looking stuff, it incorporates both demanding and non-demanding elements. I think all of that's going to count in favor of widening out the architecture. But that leaves theorists like you and like Rob perfectly free to say, well, I'm just going to talk about this top row here, because I find that that's the one that's really fascinating and important for issues of punishment and free will and maybe divine retribution, these kinds of things. Whereas somebody like me is going to focus on the relation between humor and responsibility zone in these surprising ways. And so That's the idea. That's the idea. Greater ecumenism, greater theoretical advantages, and is not incompatible with any particular research project.
Bob had a quick follow-up before I go next.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know it's harping on this point a little, but just, I guess one pushback on that, I totally appreciate that approach. I think that's a really nice approach, and sort of unifying these different sort of aspects of blaming practices and different, I guess even like sort of different concepts of blame. An implication of this though, and this is kind of really just like a terminological point, is children are blameworthy on this kind of view, and they're equally blameworthy as adults, right? That sounds very odd. And so what seems like needs to happen is that's just not the right word. And we need to just have a distinction again between the kinds of things that sort of Steve's harping on, this, whatever it is, this tracking accountability or desert, and we'll call that blame or whatever. It really just a terminological point. But what I wouldn't want is the implication of the view to be, well, kids and even mentally disabled people in different ways than empathetically disabled, they may just have as much of a tendency to respond and to like learn from these blaming practices and so on. So I don't want kids to be equally as blameworthy as adults. So that's a worry, and maybe that's just a terminological thing, but just a point about that.
Yeah, so I take that to be a huge theoretical advantage, that it incorporates kids and incorporates those with disabilities. There are crucial human goods that are involved in these kinds of interpersonal practices. As I was pointing out, that there's bonding, that there's values in bonding. There are massive prudential benefits of being someone who's engaged in these kinds of practices. And if you have the attitude going in that, nope, we're going to be exclusionary about who can play this game and who can't, then what you're doing is depriving certain people. And this has been particularly hard on people with disabilities, just being excluded from various kinds of communities. So oddly enough, I know this is being recorded, unfortunately, but oddly enough, what this view implies is that it's going to be perfectly okay to mock the disabled sometimes. Perfectly appropriate. You can just edit that out. Perfectly appropriate, because there's huge value in doing so, because it's inclusive. And so if you're just going to focus on this highly sophisticated set of capacities that's necessary for fully participating in the slighting anger and gratitude communities, then you're excluding, and there are all sorts of goods attached there, or you're excluding all sorts of people as well. And I say, let's just bring everybody in. Everybody's involved here. There's a much more inclusive view. And again, if you want to focus on the really sophisticated capacities that are necessary for slighting anger and gratitude, have at it. Have at it. And there may be, really interesting things that do connect up to the free will debate. That is sort of the traditional problem that people are focused on. Fine, that's great. But don't think that you are telling us the whole story about blame and praise. Now, you may be telling us the whole story about genuine responsibility, whatever that is. But if that's the case, I'm no longer interested in genuine responsibility, or to the detriment of studying everything else.
Kirshner had a quick follow-up.
Yeah, I just wanted a quick follow-up as well. One more price to be paid, and in addition to the one that Bob pointed out, is using Manuel Vargas's model. You've been committed to something like rule utilitarianism, either in general or about praise and blame. If someone were to be sort of strongly opposed to rule utilitarianism, and I claim we all should be, that's another reason that sort of separate from Bob, but that's a second huge cost to this ecumenical view of praise and blame.
So I don't see why I'm committed to rule utilitarianism. I know Manuel is, and that's a huge cost of his view. And I will say that to his face till the day I die. But I don't think that what I've said is committed to that at all. I haven't given the aptness conditions, for example, of this mockery blame or this other praise ordinary conception. I haven't given that. And so much more would have to be said about that. But the one thing I'm not going to do is give you a rule utilitarian justification. I can guarantee that. Now, they're going to be, Brad Hooker's going to say, well, then that's a cost of your view, Shoemaker, that you're not going rule utilitarian. But yeah, there's a lot of gaps here. But I think that's where the action is at. I think that's where the interesting theoretical action is at.
All right, so I had a question, and then after me, instead of Pat Lee, we'll go back to Bob. So I was trying to come up with not necessarily damaging counterexamples, but something along those lines to some of the asymmetries that you're going for. So I've have in mind two different things, but I could just start, I guess, by talking about the kind of mocking that's stinging and funny, but it's not obvious what norm is being violated or flouted.
Oh,
so
good.
I'm coming up with examples like if somebody makes fun of you because you went to college. Of course, everybody maybe was encouraged in high school to go to college, but then they just like, oh, hey, college over here. And it might be that what's going on here is they want you to empathize with their in-group, perhaps, or they're trying to check your arrogance level. But it also seems like the norm that people have largely adopted, you're the one following it, and they're the ones that are not. And there might be other cases, and I think this might be harder, where people talk about somebody being a do-gooder or goody two-shoes or things like that, where you're doing the right thing. It's the thing everybody else should be doing. But there's a little bit of a sting and a little bit of humor to it because you've been following the rules, not because you violated them. And so I'm wondering if it's because there is another rule that you're violating or if it's something else.
Yeah, I think both of those cases are cases of normative regimentation, that you are saying in the first case, either stop, you're sounding a little arrogant or too smart for this group, and you need to dial it back a bit. And the do-gooder, I think that's a absolutely can be a mock, but it's negative, and it's to say people shouldn't. Well, it's to say could be lighten up. Don't be so focused on morality all the time. I had two uncles, one of whom was the classic definition of a do-gooder, was just nice and polite about every single thing. And I had another uncle who I loved, who was a bit of a jerk and had the zingers. And one uncle got out of the car one day, and I was a kid, and the other uncle said, "Isn't he so nice? It makes you sick." And that's exactly that kind of zing. It's to say that no, they're failing to live up to a normative standard, which is don't be nice all the time. Niceness prevents you from being interesting. Niceness prevents you from being engaging. Niceness prevents you from being funny. And so it is a kind of complaint. So I think both of those cases are cases of you've fallen below the normative standard that I, the mocker, have. This is not to say that there's any kind of objective standards here that they're going to determine whether or not the thing is funny. It's that mockery counts as mockery coming out of my mouth, given my own normative commitments, and that's it.
Okay, yeah, so then that fits pretty nicely then. The other kind of scenario I was thinking of is the cases where you were talking about how if somebody praises you, there is not like a kind of like a moral backing to it, or there doesn't have to be a reason behind it. That seems right. But it seems like there are plenty of cases where someone's praising you and it not only feels appropriate, it's like sometimes expected for you to deflect. Like, oh, this other person helped on the project too, like I shouldn't have to take all the praise, or don't forget to praise that person, like you should be praising that person, not me. And so it seems like those kinds of cases, it's because you have empathy that you're able to then deflect appropriately. But that means like the person who's giving the praise, they're making a mistake here, right? There's so I thought that was giving some attention to I think slide 3, where it was not just about non-moral stuff, but also that there's sometimes a very much a necessary response, like you should be talking about this person, not just me. Things like that.
Yeah, no, that's valuable. Thank you. I don't think that that takes away from the thought that that you can be praised for non-moral things that you've done. It's just that morality is certainly relevant, or sees some kind of normative standards are certainly relevant for the aptness of praising. And that's what I was saying earlier. That's where the theoretical action is trying to figure out the aptness conditions of both praising and distributing praise in various ways. And as you rightly point out, deflecting praise, which is a really fascinating phenomenon. Could be done sincerely and insincerely. And there's all sorts of fascinating aspects to that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so let's go to Bob and then Hershinov. Well, actually, Bob was saying in the chat he could switch because he's been talking a lot.
I'm happy to let you go first, David.
David, I just want to try an example of hypocritical self-blame. And I won't bring in the true metaphysics of the person where split brains, dissociative disorders, and dicephalic twins are all.
Yeah, I got it.
So obviously we'll get hypocritical self-blame there. But in hypocritical self-blame just means a double standard. If I blame myself less than I blame others, or if I blame myself more than others to sort of, because I hold myself to a higher standard, I think I'm better. Is that hypocritical?
It's called hypercrisy. It's been the term coined. I'm not sure if it's coined by Casper Lippert Rasmussen, but it's hypercrisy.
Okay.
So if I blame myself more than I do others, and Dan Elkin has written about this as well. Yeah.
Okay, so that's not hypocrisy.
Right.
All right. Then I'll have to just draw on the true metaphysics. And,
and then I'll just reply by saying there has to be unity of consciousness.
all right.
I mean, you have to do it in full knowledge of.
If,
I don't want the Perry case, like the John Perry and the sugar.
Right.
Going around, somebody, who's this asshole is spilling all the sugar? Oh, well then, who are you? I mean, right.
And
it's hypocrisy either.
It's not hypocrisy if I blame myself, but just not as much as I blame someone else for the same thing. Would that be hypocritical self-blame, or that's really just hypocrisy because I'm blaming them?
No, I think that that can count as hypocrisy. And so I'm best construed as saying that there's a distinctive kind of hypocrisy. It's the kind of hypocrisy in which we think rightly, who are you to blame me? It's that kind of hypocrisy. But I think hypocrisy, it's turning out, and it's very, very hot topic in the literature these days. It's turning out that it's a multiply fractured concept, and that there are a variety of ways in which we can be hypocrites that may not be unifiable. People have tried to say, well, it shows you're not committed to the norms in question, but that's not necessarily the case in some cases. This who are you to blame me, this doesn't apply in other cases. Here's an example that some people have given of hypocritical praise. It's when I praise you, I praise the environmentalists while I drive a Hummer. Or I praise the people who are, they get up and go and they exercise while I nurse my hangover. And so all they want to say is that there just has to be a differential, there has to be a difference between the normative judgment that you're making and the way you're living your life. That's not the kind of hypocrisy I'm interested in, which really is just you have no standing. It's that kind of thing. You have no standing to blame me because you're right down here in the dirt with me. And that kind of thing just can't apply in the self case, as long as we grant, the relevant knowledge or unity of consciousness or something to avoid your metaphysical hijinks.
Now, when we do like a we blame, I just say all we people are just horrible. There's no moral standing or higher moral standing there when I just say all humans are just nasty. right? So you don't need higher moral standing to do blame. when
Yeah.
it's-
Yeah, that may well be the case. That may well be true too. Although, I mean, one way to deal with that case for somebody who wants to try to maybe preserve a unity, it would be to say there has to be a difference between blame and mere judgments of poorness or wrongdoing. And so in that kind of case, you might just have that person saying, humanity is just scum, but that's a mere judgment. For it to rise to the level of being counting as blame, it looks like there has to be some kind of disgust with humanity. And in that case, I feel a little force to you're having to take some kind of, you're taking yourself to have a higher stand for you to be disgusted. Disgust kind of implies that the disgusting object is lower than you. So that might be one way to push back. I don't care so much, but that'd be one way to go.
Is that me?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yep, it's Bob and
Wait.
then Steve, and I think Steve will probably have the last question.
Okay. This is also on standing to blame, so I'm glad David brought that up. I can't remember if I've read anything that you've said on this, or I just don't remember what your position is. But so my question is about that. I'm just wondering what you think about sort of two things. One is I also have I guess a question of whether hypocritical self-blame is possible. So the way that you sort of pushed it back against that was talking about this overt like conversation you might have with yourself, right? Like, who are you to say you? And then I'm wondering if it need not be so overt, right? So like when we blame ourselves, it seems like a lot of times there's kind of an inner struggle there, or you're a little torn. I'm really kind of feel blame towards myself, but I mean, I did the thing. Maybe I thought I had some reasons, and just that inner struggle or being torn about that I wonder what you think about that counting as kind of a hypocritical self-blame. Like, you are blaming yourself. You kind of recognize that who are you? Because you're like, well, I don't know. I'm a little torn about blaming myself. Maybe that doesn't get you enough. I'm wondering what you think about that. The second part is, it seems like this is maybe clear from our conversations that this model, or at least this point about hypocritical self-blame presupposes that you need standing to blame. It presupposes the view that you must have standing to blame in order for your blame to be apt, right? I don't know if I'm a minority, but I don't really share these intuitions. I don't know that you have to have standing to blame, certainly not to actually blame, but for the blame to be apt. And then the question becomes, well, what does that mean? And the sort of question going around this is I wonder if presupposing this kind of view where you need the standing to blame for your blame to be apt, if that is inconsistent with, or is at least in tension with, the forward-looking nature of the blaming stuff. Because why would you need standing to blame if blame is sort of rehabilitative, or it works towards this function of making the person recognize reasons and so on? It's just unclear why you would need standing to blame, or at least the standing would be very different than sort of how you were we originally think of that. So yeah.
Yeah. So that second question was that's what I was trying to respond to, basically, in responding to part of what Stephen was saying about accountability. That I think to the extent standing is relevant and authority is relevant, it's relevant for the demanding forms of blame, but not the non-demanding forms. And so there would remain a symmetry, not an asymmetry, a symmetry between the slighted anger, which I think demands remorseful acknowledgement, and gratitude, which demands gratification and that you recognize the benefit you made for me. But then both of the main ordinary conception of praise is non-demanding, as is what I put in to be symmetrical with that, which would be not mocking blame. So I don't have to have any particular kind of standing, although this may be a source of controversy. I was wondering what people might think about this. If I have to have some sort of standing to mock you, And there are interesting interpersonal features. We often do say, oh, I feel funny mocking her. I don't know her very well. I mean, think about that. So it's only, the people I know well that I feel most comfortable in mocking and teasing in a certain sort of way. So it may be certain kind of group membership is the requisite standing for mockery, blame. But the same could be true of praising. We have to at least be a relevant member of the group. It'd be odd if I ran in a local race and I won, and then a little girl from Albania sends me an email saying, I saw this on the news and good job. It's just weird. I don't know if it renders it inapt. It's just weird. So that's what I want to think about that. The case of the torn blame is interesting. If we're going to, again, the puzzle of hypocrisy only arises with respect to this kind of self-directed moral anger, which is a demanding, authoritative kind of anger. And it sounded in the cases you described it that person isn't there yet. There has to be a certain kind of settled conviction that you've done something wrong here in order for me to authoritatively demand remorseful acknowledgement. And if you're still kind of unsettled, then you're by definition not there yet. And once you are there, I think then in the psychologically healthy, that's the moment at which guilt arises. So that's the self-effacing part.
Interesting. I just very quickly, I was trying to think of being there. I was thinking more like you're sort of two minds about it. You are there, but you're reluctant, not in the sense that your other side is not there, but just hard for you to accept that you're there.
Yeah, I've been speaking in terms of this, being an instant transmogrification, and it's clearly not. And it's certainly not going to be the case if you've done an egregious wrong. It can't be the case that I'm angry at myself for having killed somebody, and then I instantly feel guilt, and that's it. That's the end of the self-blame. No, there's got to be a process that it takes a long time sometimes for you to fully acknowledge what it is that you did, and that's what you're wrestling with, I think, in the case that you gave.
So John Lisa wanted to jump in if possible, and Kirshner let him go ahead of him if you'd like. So go ahead, John.
Okay, just quick. I was curious how big the tent you want to be, or you're working with. So I was sort of thinking about, with animals, we praise animals and blame them, and it seems it's not. And it's maybe more character formation, especially early on in training. And that seems not really, it's not backward looking. So that I think would be an example of the kind of forward looking kind of function that but I was just wondering whether, some kinds of praise in those kinds of contexts, are you praising the animal or the child or something, as opposed to praising yourself for what that thing has done? And so are there these cases where it's kind of complicated exactly who the praise is directed towards, I suppose.
Yeah, that's great. I haven't thought about this at all, but that's great. And then the asymmetry, if we allow in animals on the front end, the asymmetry would be that my dog is invulnerable to my mockery. No matter how much I mock my dog,
that's right.
Right. Yes,
you're great. Right.
So I want to resist. Then I'm theoretically required to resist extending this to the praise case to animals. So there has to be, I think, some kind of comprehension of the praise as praise. And I think what you would get in the case of the training. So you're exactly right. The praise of dogs is a great corrective and enables them to, it's entirely forward looking and helps to train. So it is negative, and it's not mocking, but it's just a note. But there the thought might be that these are responses to different tones of voice and different relationships and different well, those two things would be valuable enough that serve as the relevant kind of corrective, and so wouldn't fall under the rubric of my dog recognized that I complimented him for doing a good job, and that he continued to do this particular job, he would continue to be the recipient of my compliments. So I think something like that is going to have to be built in here, that I've got some kind of communicative as praise element that's going to be necessary for the relevant sort of corrective. But again, I haven't thought about this at all. It's a really, really valuable question. So I'm not sure I have anything more to say about it. Thanks.
Thanks. No, great
All right.
talk. But, yeah.
All right, so it is it's 6 after. So let's thank our speaker, and we can socialize. And Steve has a question for you and all that. I'm gonna stop recording though.